They ride in packs across the open road, their leather jackets adorned with ominous insignia. For decades, the Hells Angels have carved a notorious reputation across North America through violence, intimidation, and ruthless criminal enterprise. Few have dared to confront these self-proclaimed outlaws and vicious enforcers of the underworld, but today, justice strikes back. Behind prison bars, hidden from the open highway, exiled Hells Angels now serve hard time for their merciless crimes. Coming up, we unmask the unforgiven sins of bikers, condemned to die in a cell. Ruthless offenders now confined for the rest of their lives. Ricky Jenks was a fully patched member of the Notorious biker gang when he was handed a life sentence for his role as an enforcer in a brutal 2018 murder. The large, intimidating Jenks served as muscle for the San Bernardino chapter and had a reputation for violence. Along with 3 other Hells Angels, Jenks was convicted of kidnapping, torturing, and murdering a drug dealer who had failed to pay a debt to the biker gang. The group lured the man to a remote area where they interrogated him for hours, beating him with bats and tools before finally executing him with gunshots. At trial, prosecutors revealed Jenks's long criminal history, including assault, robbery, and firearm charges. A Hells Angels insider turned state's witness said Jenks bragged about hurting people and described prison as a badge of honor. The court handed down the maximum sentence, condemning the depraved cruelty and lack of remorse. Jenks had been a Hells Angel for over a decade and was heavily involved in the gang's drug trafficking and extortion activities. He served as protection and enforcement for deals, using his imposing size and violent reputation to intimidate rivals and debtors. The murdered drug dealer was far from Jenks' first victim. The prosecution assembled evidence tying Jenks to nearly a dozen brutal beatings and unsolved disappearances over his biker gang career. Ex-girlfriends testified about Jenks' short temper, revealing chilling stories of abuse and threats. His own son took the stand against him, saying he lived in fear of his father. Jenks' cold stare and smug demeanor throughout the trial enraged the victims' families, who demanded the stiffest punishment possible. The judge agreed, telling Jenks he had cast off his humanity and society deserved protection from him. Jenks will likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. Neil Cantrell was a longtime biker and the leader behind a 2016 extortion plot. Along with his 38-year-old son Stephen and fellow Hells Angel member Robert Lowry, Cantrell murdered a former associate. The Alberta gang leader and his partners kidnapped and assaulted the man from British Columbia, who was no longer interested in their illegal marijuana growing operation. During the trial, Justice Ward Branch of the British Columbia Supreme Court acknowledged that 62-year-old Neil was the ringleader of the extortion scheme at the time. The judge also stated that Neil and his co-accused deserved even longer sentences than what they received. In 2020, all 3 men were convicted of kidnapping, extortion, aggravated assault, and overcoming resistance for the vicious attack on Robert Hull, who had been associated with Cantrell over 12 years earlier in Hope, British Columbia. Back in December 2014, Hulla had traveled to Edmonton to inform his partners he wanted out of their illegal business, even offering up his growing equipment to Cantrell. Hulla didn't hear from Neil until July 2016, when Neil contacted him to arrange a meeting. The very next day, when Hulla arrived at a roadside pullout near Hope, he was seized and beaten. Afterwards, Hulla was taken to his house, where the 3 convicts attempted to force him to sign over the property. RCMP officers arrived and Hulla was hospitalized for cuts, broken bones, and a burn on his forehead. He was severely impacted by the brutal assault and forced into the witness protection program. As Judge Branch noted, Hulla left town fearing for his life. Branch also said a report filed for the sentencing hearing showed Cantrell had absolutely no remorse for his actions. Quoting the report, Branch said Cantrell felt he was definitely owed money and was trying to get what was rightfully his. At the sentencing hearing, Neil calmly sat and listened as he was given 10 years in prison, showing no emotion or regrets. In another case, Adam Lee Hall was a very well-known member of the Hells Angels Biker Club. Hall was one of 3 men facing charges for the 2011 murders of 3 individuals from Berkshire County. The main victim, David Glasser, was supposed to testify against Hall in court in relation to previous alleged crimes committed by Hall. That's when Glasser, his roommate Edward Frampton, and their friend Robert Chadwell all went missing from Pittsfield. During the court proceedings, prosecutors disclosed that Hall was a high-ranking local Hells Angels member who held significant power and influence in the region. Together with 2 other men, Hall kidnapped the 3 victims in broad daylight from Frampton's home and ended their lives in an elaborate and premeditated murder plot. Around 2 weeks after disappearing without a trace, the dismembered bodies of the 3 victims were found scattered in Beckett. The 3 defendants were given separate trials, a strategic move designed to maximize the chances of convictions by preventing collaborating alibis. During Hall's solo trial, the jury unanimously declared him guilty on all counts after only 17 hours of deliberating. The judge handed down the maximum punishment allowable by law: 3 consecutive life sentences without any possibility of parole for the heinous murders. In addition to criticizing the horrific cruelty displayed by the calculated plot, the judge also gave Hall the maximum sentence for related crimes of armed robbery, assault, and kidnapping, adding decades more to Hall's time in prison. The Superior Court jury found Hall guilty of all 3 ruthless murders and a total of 12 other egregious crimes, after 3 weeks of compelling testimony from witnesses and investigators. The grieving families of the victims said Hall deserved every day of the harsh punishment for deliberately targeting the mentally disabled Glasser in order to prevent him from testifying against Hall. Throughout his trial and sentencing, Hall never showed any remorse or took any responsibility for his actions. The evidence presented was overwhelming, leaving the jury with no reasonable doubt of Hall's monstrous guilt. Hall had a lengthy criminal history and reputation as an enforcer for the Hells Angels, using violence and intimidation tactics. But this time, the justice system caught up with him and delivered the full force of the law. Hells Angel Travis Burrow was sentenced to life for the savage 2009 bludgeoning of a rival biker gang member in Oklahoma. Burrow and an accomplice invaded the victim's home and attacked him with baseball bats and a hammer as retribution for an ongoing turf dispute between the gangs. Burrow had risen to be vice president of his local Hells Angels chapter and was known as an aggressive enforcer. During the trial, Burrow remained stoic and refused to admit guilt, even when confronted with overwhelming forensic evidence. The judge denounced the premeditated and brutal nature of the execution-style murder in handing down the life term. A 15-year veteran of the Hells Angels, Burrow had orchestrated a violent expansion campaign to drive other biker gangs out of Oklahoma. The bludgeoning murder was just the latest in a series of attacks targeting rivals. Testimony showed Burrow declared open season on competitors who didn't flee. Witnesses described Burrow as obsessed with reputation and retribution, demanding violent punishment for any perceived sign of disrespect. Lower-ranking gang members said they went along out of fear. Burrow's own cousin testified to seeing Burrow assault dozens over petty grudges. Even with a mountain of damning evidence and victim statements, the stone-faced Burrow denied all culpability, showing zero remorse. The sentencing judge called him pathological and a threat to civilized society, saying the only proper recourse was to permanently segregate him from the public. Burrow spat defiantly as he was led away in shackles.